Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Tom Dillon, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Helen Leathers. Good morning, Helen.
Good
morning.
How are you? I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm wonderfully well. Thank you very much.
Good. What are we going to be talking about on our podcast today?
Today, we're talking about an approach to coaching, an approach that we know very well. So it's quite a new approach to coaching. There are some other organisations that train people to coach in this way, but we've very much made it our own. And so we're going to be talking about transformational coaching.
Excellent. So what makes transformational coaching as an approach different to other approaches, do you think?
It's versatility, I would say.
Yeah, I like that.
Because I've done lots of coaching training in the past, and I've seen other people that have come through different coaching training, and they have a way of being in the coaching room. But if that doesn't work, they don't necessarily know how to flex out of that. So if someone's just been on a coaching course and learned the GROW model, which is a useful model, it's not perfect, but it's useful. So looking at goals, reality, options, and way forward, that's fine, as long as you get someone that presents in that way. If they don't have a goal, what do you do then? So there isn't really the versatility in that sort of approach. So we incorporate many of these approaches that I'm saying aren't particularly flexible into the transformational coaching approach. And it's looking at all of them that gives it its flexibility.
So being able to move from one style of coaching into another, because what we need to be able to do, I think it's fair to say, is react to how the client is showing up in the room, so that we're flexing to what they need rather than our own agenda, which isn't coaching, is it?
No. And I would say that I'm quite a person-centred coach, so I leave lots of space in my coaching. I also incorporate Gestalt into my coaching, but then I also incorporate transactional analysis, some solution-focused coaching, some positive psychology, a bit of neuroscience. So there are lots of ways that I am in the coaching room. So I have that integrative approach to coaching myself, and that's really what transformational coaching is. We're looking to create some transformation for the person in front of us.
And I think thinking about this, because I remember when I sat down to pull together everything for my accreditation, I was like, what sort of coach am I? I've really got to think about my approach. And I realised that although I hadn't been taught this is person-centred, this is solution-focused, this is Gestalt, I realised that I also combine lots of those different approaches combined with some meditative practice and that idea of sort of spirituality and what goes beyond our thinking mind. Yeah. So we definitely integrate, both of us, some of the same things and some different things to make us unique as coaches.
Yeah. And in terms of offering a transformational coaching approach, then I think we have decided what best fits that description.
Yes.
So we are looking for elements of each of those other approaches that are going to lead to some transformation for the people in front of us. I think that's where the difference comes. So we're not particularly interested in transactional coaching. So that's, well, what's your goal? What are your options? How are you going to get there? What are you going to do? And they go off and they do that. Or not. So they achieve their goal or don't achieve the goal. But nothing's really changed for them. They've just work towards a goal and achieved it. Now, I mean, there could be some transformation in that they've managed to achieve a goal they haven't before, but the likelihood is that the next time they have a goal, they're just back to, what do I do? How do I do that?
Yeah.
So we're really interested in bringing about some transformation for the person in front of us.
So that seems to be a lot more about deeper thinking, about lasting change, and also about giving them something that allows them to feel empowered, that they could perhaps use again. So adding the coaching will add to the inner resources that the coachee has on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and sometimes it is about bringing about transformation in the room, that something shifts in the person. And that's the holy grail of coaching, isn't it? To get that aha moment in the room where you can see a shift taking place in front of you.
Isn't that lovely when someone says, oh,
yeah.
And there's that moment, a golden moment of realisation about something perhaps that's been a long-held belief or a difficult topic.
Yeah, and I just recalling to mind someone that I was coaching, who's an academic who wanted to be a professor, and just kept saying, well, I've left it too late. I've got all these hurdles in the way. And there was a point in the coaching when I asked her, what if you didn't have hurdles? What if they were stepping stones? What's the next step? And just in that moment when she realised there was a next step and she could take that next step, that you could just see all of that, I've left it too late, fell away. And that's transformational, isn't it? If you suddenly know, well, I haven't left it too late, that's a huge mind shift.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So let's look at some of the areas that get incorporated into a transformational coaching approach. And I mentioned me being a person-centered coach, and that was my original sort of training, my grounding in coaching. And I think there can be something transformational in offering that person-centered space where you just listen and allow the person to think to the end of their thoughts. So I think that can be transformative, transformational, but it isn't always. So sometimes people left to do their own thinking don't actually come up with any new thinking at all. They just go over the old thinking that they've had.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for them to get that out there and to tell their story. But I don't think that in itself is transformational.
So I think there's a danger that you stay in your story and repeat the story.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I think sometimes from people I've spoken to who've had therapy, perhaps long-term therapy, they stay in that talking and not moving out of the story and forward.
Yeah. And I had someone come to a co-coaching group once that was a person-centered therapist, done that for 5 years, but wanted to move into coaching. And he practiced with someone doing a coaching, it was a genuine coaching session. But he just was in that person-centered approach of just reflecting back what was being said. And the lady was getting quite frustrated. She said, so I want you to help me. I want you to help me move forward. I need to find some motivation. So I want you to motivate me. And he's going, so it sounds like you're having trouble with motivation. And she said, yes, so I'd like you to help me. And he just stayed in that space for 20 minutes and nothing changed. Nothing happened. He just kept reflecting back. And that was a good demonstration to me of if you are purely person-centered, it's very difficult to flex away from that.
Yeah, it gives you really good foundation skills, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I love the person. I love Carl Rogers. I think was a wonderful man. So yeah, I really buy into that, giving space to coachees and letting them talk. But there comes a time when we perhaps want to move things on a bit. Yeah.
And that's where we might introduce something like Tom's Code, which is the model we train.
Yeah, we've introduced that in an earlier episode.
Episode 10.
Episode 10. So yes, and there's a model that what we're interested in within that model and where it differs from something like the GROW model or Oscar or Clear or any of those other coaching models is that we're not particularly looking for a goal at the beginning. We're looking for what they want to talk about. And later on, we look for the change that they want to see. What would you like to have happen? And that, again, is the transformation, isn't it? We want to change. So the person-centered coachee who's telling their story, that's fine. Okay, but what would you like to have happen? That moves them on, doesn't it? That takes them away from the story. So we're suddenly into new territory and thinking about the future.
Absolutely. So another coaching approach that we cover on the course is the solution-focused. And I think even if we just looked at person-centered and solution-focused as in combination, tell the story, move out of the story and into the future, then that's transformative in and of itself. And I really love the solution-focused approach. We looked at that in episode 11 of the podcast, and it focuses not so much on the problems and remedies, but on the outcomes, the desired outcomes that the person we're working with wants to see. And it's much more future-focused. It can allow us to move faster sometimes. I don't think we always need to move fast, but it's a faster process.
Because it comes from brief therapy. So moving away from that person-centered therapy approach of just sitting with the story for session after session, it is designed as a brief intervention. So the fact that solution-focused coaching exists, its origins are in that brief intervention.
Yeah.
So it is naturally going to move faster than a person-centered approach.
Yeah.
And you'll notice that both of those approaches that we've looked at come from a psychotherapeutic
Yes.
background. So I think that's something about the transformational coaching approach, is that we're drawing on psychology. We're not
Yes.
too interested in management techniques and how a manager might use coaching. We're thinking about psychology and how the person in front of us is thinking and how that thinking might change in order to unlock something and allow them to move forward.
Absolutely.
So I think that's very much part and parcel of the transformational coaching approach, is the psychological approach to coaching.
Yeah. And whilst we don't focus on management coaching, this is so useful just for people. So it can absolutely be used in the executive coaching world.
Yeah,
and we both do.
Because if we're dealing with people, it's all about psychology.
Yes.
You can't escape the psychology, and you might brush over it as a manager and ignore it, but it's there.
Yeah.
It's going on for the person in front of you.
So also what I love about the solution-focused approach is that it focuses on strengths, which we come back to in positive psychology, but it's about looking at the strengths that someone has already and engaging with those, and ways that perhaps they've used those strengths in the past that they could apply to the current problem or change. So I like that. Creating a future vision of where you want to head can be really useful, and generating new thinking about what's available options-wise, and really getting into that generative thinking space, and then taking small steps.
Yeah.
It's about small steps towards that ultimate change that we want to see. And one of the things I love about solution focus, one of the things, and I've spoken about it before, is that idea that between coaching conversations, something can shift. And we talk about this a lot, don't we? How things can change outside of the coaching room. And I think it's the magic that happens between sessions. And I like that that's recognised within solution-focused coaching. So then we move on and look at the cognitive behavioural approach to coaching.
So again, another approach that comes from a psychotherapeutic background.
Yes, and that we've done a whole episode on as
Yeah.
well, which is episode 14 of the podcast. And cognitive behavioural coaching supports coachees in really thinking realistically about their life, their world, their behaviours, their actions, and helping them to overcome limiting beliefs and that unhelpful thinking that might be getting in their way, really. Sometimes we have repeated patterns, don't we, that can keep tripping us up. And if we start to become aware of them and then have strategies for dealing with them, that can really help. And I think we spoke earlier about how transformational coaching can provide resources for coachees. And I think perhaps CBC, in a way that other approaches don't, and I've heard this from people who've had CBT, the therapy version, they say, I did it once and then I had some skills to take forward, which is really lovely. So we get really into that thinking about our thinking in cognitive behavioural coaching.
And again, that's quite transformative, isn't it? That you
Yes.
have some skills that when those thinking patterns return, perhaps some negative thoughts return, you've got a strategy, you've got a way of coping with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, if you had just done a basic coaching course and learnt to coach using the GROW model or the Oscar model, and just had that very simple way of coaching, which is absolutely fine for many for many occasions, where do you find the flexibility then when someone has unhelpful thinking patterns to explore that with them and to help them to overcome it? I don't think you've got that versatility if you've just learnt to coach using the GROW model.
And I think that might concern some new coaches thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do with this.
If you have someone in front of you that has limiting beliefs, asking them what options they've got isn't going to help, is it?
No.
So I think it's definitely a useful part of the transformational coaching approach that we can use when required with coaches that have that way of thinking about themselves and about the world. So another way of working in a transformational way is to look at metaphor and the metaphorical landscape that someone occupies. So that can be really interesting in not only looking at what their metaphor is for the world they have at the moment, but also the world of the future. So the lady I talked about with her, she's just got all these hurdles in front of her. So actually changing the hurdles to stepping stones was transformational.
Metaphor,
and that was all that it took. And interestingly, we had a lady on our course recently who, and I won't talk about the context, but she's Spanish, and she talked about the metaphor of having conversations with people that perhaps are going to provoke a response. They're going to be quite contentious, perhaps.
Okay.
So it's going to produce a response, and might end up in an argument. So apparently the Spanish expression is "don't enter the garden."
Oh, lovely.
So she was talking about a conversation, and she said, we have this expression, "don't enter the garden." So actually what we did in that was, what does it mean to you not to enter the garden? And there were values that she held that made it difficult for her to not enter the garden. But then we talked about how the garden would look if she entered it in a way that was right for her, and that kept her safe and kept everyone else safe.
So she could still express her views, but in a safe, compassionate way.
So this kind of wild, overgrown garden with thorns and everything else suddenly became this manicured garden with a path leading through it that would take her on her way. And so suddenly there was a way through the conversations she wanted to have by using a metaphor of a garden, which is lovely, isn't it?
Really lovely.
And I remember, this was several months ago now, but I remember that conversation because of that metaphor. I'm sure she will be able to recall that conversation and the metaphor involved. So that is a really powerful way of working with someone and bringing about transformation in the way that they think about something.
Fabulous. And we work with metaphor without even realising it, don't we? So, by the nature of our language.
Yeah. And again, if you haven't explored metaphor as a coach, then how would you pick up on the metaphors that are being used? They're just going to pass you by, aren't they?
Yeah.
And not
absolutely.
everyone uses metaphor. Some people speak quite literally, but when it does occur, you want to be able to pick up on it.
Yes.
And then we have coachees who come with perhaps relational issues. That again, if you've just done the GROW model, how do you work through that? You could ask people what their options are, but quite often those situations are really complex and really difficult for someone else to take someone else's perspective. So if you've got a coachee in front of you and they're telling their story about the other person, and he said this and I said, and then they said that, and this is what happened, it's very difficult to take them out of that and get them to look at it from a different perspective. So a couple of ways that we introduce that in our transformational coaching training is transactional analysis, which looks at, we've done an episode on this, can't remember which one, 40 something.
Episode 31.
31, well, that far back.
Yeah.
So that looks at how we interact with other people and actually providing that framework. So showing someone the parent, adult, child model or the drama triangle, again, can be quite transformational in terms of how they look at those relationships. And then we also have the Gestalt approach to coaching, which, again, you can look at relationships from different perspectives. So it might be looking in on a conversation from the clock on the wall. So becoming the clock on the wall and listening into a conversation. But in being weird, it can be quite transformational.
Yes.
Or you might become the other person and speak as though you're them. And that can be really powerful in bringing about that change in the way that you see a relationship.
Mm. So then we have some scope to introduce some body work, some somatic coaching, which can really unlock something in our coachees. And it's really about reconnecting with our body and understanding that we can feel things in our body, but also that we can kind of hack our brain a little bit by reconnecting with our body and imagining what it would be like to be in the place that we want to be. So how would it feel if that in my body, if that change was to occur? And then we can kind of try it on for size, if you like, try it out. And I'm a firm believer that when we start to hold our body differently and feel how it might feel to be where we want to be, then that change in our thinking can start to occur. And I think that's very nicely linked in with some of the other topics that we cover on the course. But I do love the somatic approach, the embodiment work. And I use it a lot with my clients, and we do go through it on the Transformational Coaching Diploma as an approach, linked in with some neuroscience, which we love, and again have done an episode on neuroscience fairly recently.
Yeah, on the neuroscience side, we introduced the SCARF model, and had a client recently who talked to about scarf model, and he recognised that status was important to him in the context he was working in. And actually came back to I had a session with him yesterday and came back to that. He said, it really stuck with me, that status thing. That's really changed the way that I think about it. So again, there's a transformation that's taken place in the way he thinks about his workspace and his colleagues. And it's made a big difference to how he interacts.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's lovely when we get those stories back, isn't it? And then we have the positive psychology approach to coaching, which we did talk about in episode 26. And is one of the approaches that we cover on the course. Absolutely love how positive psychology and coaching mirror each other in lots of ways. And there's wonderful positive psychology interventions that we can introduce to clients. However, much like you've already said, Tom, about the other approaches, if you were to solely learn about positive psychology interventions and theories and models, if you then took that into the coaching space and you had no other coaching skills, how do you deliver that? So being able to introduce positive psychology in combination with the foundational coaching skills and all of the other elements is what makes it transformational, because you can pick up on a part of positive psychology and introduce it in a way that not just informs the client, but draws out of them what they make of it, how they can utilise it, and draws out of them the answers from within. Whereas if you just did positive psychology and lectured on positive psychology, you'd just be passing on information, whereas combining it in a coaching capacity allows you really to facilitate the changes.
Yeah, and I think the intervention, the positive psychology interventions, the PPIs, are useful and they're well researched.
Yes.
But they are sort of exercises that you might offer to a client. But there's no real coaching in that.
No.
That's just, here's an exercise, go away and do this. But if we think about journaling as an exercise, that's a positive psychology researched intervention. Practice some journaling. The way that people journal and the way they come back and reflect to the coach, you have to be able to work with that as a coach. So if you don't have any coaching skills, then how would you do that?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is why we've pulled all these together, because we can help facilitate that transformation with our coaching skills added in.
I like to think that transformational coaching brings the best of all of those different approaches to life. So whether it's through therapy or a different style of coaching, we're drawing out the bits that are really useful and going, here's a bit that comes from this. And we're quite explicit about that. We label them and say this is a cognitive behavioural approach or this is a positive psychology approach. So we're not bundling stuff and calling it our own. We are presenting the different approaches and saying, actually, this is really useful in bringing about transformation for the coachees in front of you. And you can pick and choose what works for you, what resonates with you, but also what is going to work in the context the client's working in.
Yeah, so if someone thinks, I don't particularly resonate with that tool or that exercise or that way of coaching, they may still meet a client and think, actually, I know I didn't resonate with that tool, but that would be really useful in this scenario. And they'd have it there in that toolbox. So I love bringing all these things together, and I think that it really does create transformation in people.
Excellent. So that's our overview of transformational coaching as a coaching approach. As I say, it integrates lots of other approaches and really allows you to work with whatever comes into the coaching room in a way that perhaps specialising in one particular approach doesn't. So it just gives you as a coach a great deal of flexibility. So thank you, Helen. I've really enjoyed talking through that this morning. And,
me too.
Allowing people to see what transformational coaching means. If they've heard the phrase bandied about, then that's what transformational coaching is.
That's what transformational coaching is for us.
Yes.
Other people might have a different definition.
They might, yeah. Feel free to comment.
Yeah, we'd love to hear that. And next time, we're going to be talking about one of those tools that I mentioned just at the end there, which is journaling.
Yes. Excellent. I shall look forward to that.
See you next time then.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.